Have you ever heard of the Brooklyn Papyri? Many people haven't. The Brooklyn Papyri is a document that was found in Egypt, and it dates back to the late 1800 BCE and the early 1700 BCE. The document was written on front to back for over 90 years. And during that 90 years, it has a list of slaves, and it has a list of Asiatic slaves, as the Egyptian people called the Semitic people Asiatic. Some of the names do fit some of these tribes of Israel that we later hear about in the Bible, of course, as far as Joseph is concerned, and all the way up to Moses. So many Christians have looked at this Brooklyn Papyri to say that it is proof that there were Semitic slaves in Egypt, and it is proof that their Exodus story is true. But then there's the problem. When you actually research the information about the Brooklyn Papyri, one of the things that stands out is the fact that it mentions the Pharaoh at the time, which was Sebek Hotep. Now, we don't know if it's Sebek Hotep III or Sebek Hotep the eighth, but what we do know is that Sebek Hotep was a Egyptian pharaoh that only lasted for a very short period of time, and during this 18th dynasty, he switched, the pharaoh job switched very rapidly. So it wasn't something that occurred where a pharaoh held his rule for 50 years, 100 years, or anything of that nature, but only for a very short period of time, a couple of years here and there. The problem with that is that the document itself and Sebek Hotep actually existed in the late 1800s BCE and the early 1700 BCE. Now, some Christians would then jump and say, well, that proves that Semitic people were in Egypt as slaves. And yes, some of them were in Egypt as slaves, as this document and other inscriptions demonstrate that when the Egyptians conquered the Levant, they did bring POWs into place and brought them into slavery. But the issue here is that Joseph, according to your Bible chronology, did not come to Egypt until the late 1800s, late 1800s through the 1700s BCE. Well, that seems to match now, doesn't it? If that's when Joseph came. The problem is that for 230 something odd years, the Hebrew people, according to the Bible, were not slaves in Egypt at that time frame. It is the last 200 years that they were slaves. And that time frame simply does not match your story, that there's this large number of Hebrew slaves that were in existence. Now, other apologists have tried to say that, well, during the late 1800s, 1700s, the Pharaoh in southern Egypt conquered northern Egypt and would not have known about Joseph or remembered Joseph, and then therefore he conquered northern Egypt, and the Hyksos also conquered, and in their conquering, they made the Hebrew people into slaves. Unfortunately, the time frame still doesn't fit. The time frame of the Hyksos and the southern kingdom of Egypt making some Semitic people into slaves would have occurred during the time frame that the Hebrew people were supposedly thriving in Egypt, not during the time frame that they are determined to have been enslaved in Egypt. So although the papyri does show that there were some Semitic slaves in Egypt, it does not say that they were Israelites. They could have been Amorites, they could have been Hittites, they could have been Canaanites, they could have been any number of Semitic tribes that were in the Levant. And you have to remember, Semitic, it means that they had a common language, that they had some commonality in culture, but that does not mean that they were the Israelites. And the document demonstrates that they were slaves over 200 years prior to when your Exodus story would have made them into slaves. And therefore, it is not proof of your Exodus, but is actually proof that goes against the Exodus story. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.